Hello out there, thinkers, linkers, and mappers. We are really happy to host a series of conversations around the topic of tools for thinking. Our longer-term goal is to spark a diverse, connected, shared memory that will help us make important decisions together. Our near-term goal with these podcasts is to blow more oxygen on the growing tools for thinking sector, addressing key issues and talking with the people who are doing the work. This podcast is created by BetaWorks, a New York City-based startup studio. I'm Jerry Mikulski, your interlocutor and obsessive mind mapper. Our topic today is thinking from the bottom up. Our guests are Sonke Ahrens and Gordon Brander, the founder of Subconscious. And we're going to dive into note-taking and protocols and a series of topics that have a lot of juice for all of us here. But first, I'll ask each of our guests to introduce themselves lightly. Sonke, can you say, how did you get to the place you are now with note-taking and Zettelkasten and things like that?
Yeah, thank you for the invite. I'm the author of How to Take Smart Notes, a book that came out of procrastinating on my doctoral thesis, and also out of frustration of not having a good guide for students to write papers and deal with more complex projects.
Love that. And you just happened to start improving your note-taking, or did you hit some work that suddenly opened this up for you, or how did you trip across what became your sort of methods?
Well, Niklas Luhmann, the brain behind the Zettelkasten system, was the author I read most. Was very much interested in systems theory, so it's a sociological theory. And in systems theory, it's all about how to reduce external complexity, allowing internally complexity to build up. And it took me a while to understand that his practical way of writing is very much mirroring the theoretical framework, because in the Zettelkasten it is reducing complexity from the outside to be able to build up complexity internally. And it took me a while to understand that this is more than just a quirky way of taking and organizing notes, but it is much more interesting when you get into it and the reasons why it works and the connections with new ideas in learning theory and learning research. So it kind of took on and became an interest for a while, and it seemed worth writing it down and let the world know that it kind of makes sense to think about it a little bit more deeply.
Thank you. And it's a rich and deep vein of ideas and practices, as we'll see sort of through this call. Thank you. Gordon, a little bit about your path here and also maybe your bridges, your connections to note-taking and some of Sonke's work.
Yeah, I'm Gordon Brander. I'm CEO of Subconscious. So at Subconscious, we're building a worldwide Web3 thought graph. So you could think of this as something kind of like Obsidian graph or Roam graph, networked thought, but distributed over a peer-to-peer open protocol. I spent most of my career working on the web platform and on browsers. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were kind of trapping our thoughts in little app boxes, and that one of the magical things about the early web is that it built on top of this open protocol called HTTP. That ended up sort of blossoming into an enormous ecosystem. So I started wondering what might we be able to do with a shared protocol for thought. And actually, Sonke, I have a copy of your book here. This was really influential in the early stages of thinking through the idea maze of this problem space. You can sort of see maybe in this camera, we've got a bunch of bookmarks here. This is sort of my heat map of insights, and one more little thing here. I don't know if you can see those shoe boxes up on my top shelf there, but that was my Zettelkasten that I used to develop the ideas for for subconscious, both the protocol and the app. So I have to say your thinking has been very influential on my own thought process.
Love that. And Luhmann left behind, I don't know, 100,000 notes. Is that some large number of his sort of life work in boxes like that?
I think 70,000.
70,000 sounds right. Yeah.
Published manuscripts still in the making, yeah.
Sonke, could you introduce Zettelkasten, slip box? How do we think about it?
Sure. I mean, it's not a technique Luhmann invented himself. It's a very old technique, which is basically just collecting standardized notes in one place. And what was unique about his system is that it was not sorted by topics, but by having a fixed place within the system. So he just numbered the notes individually, usually with only one idea per note. And by changing between numbers and letters, he was able to branch out internally when he added later notes to an existing note. And what is special about this system is that it very much emphasizes the development of ideas. So the richness comes from being able to add to existing ideas, expanding on them, and developing thoughts that can then later be turned into manuscripts, articles, books, etc. And being able to use information you encounter along the way. When you research for one paper, you cannot help but encounter interesting ideas that are not particularly fitting into the project you're currently working on, but maybe interesting for future projects. And for him, knowing that he will spend the rest of his life and his whole career on writing and thinking, it just kind of made sense to use all these accidental insights, accidental findings, to add them to possible future projects, and therefore building up a huge resource he could later draw from. And that solves a lot of problems people who write often encounter. The fear of the blank page, the question what to write on, because you can just look up where things have kind of accumulated. And especially when you're a student getting familiar with a topic, you don't know in the beginning where rich material is. You don't know if there are good articles and books about the question you're interested in, but you need that. You can't invent everything on your own. So it kind of makes sense to turn it around and start collecting what you encounter, doing the things you do anyway, and then make the decision on what to write, what to turn into a manuscript. And I think that's what Gordon mentioned, that it turns a usually top-down process around and enables you to develop something bottom-up.
It's really interesting. Many years ago, I was a big fan of HyperCard, as are many people kind of in our field here. And I realized HyperCard was stacks of cards. Isn't that funny? And I was using HyperCard in a way that I think was my own. I had never heard of Zettelkasten until much, much later. But I created my poor man's version of that by creating little short unique strings that I would attach to cards. So if I had a new contact that I put into the contact zone of my HyperCard deck, I would put NNETS for neural nets, because I knew that that person was interested in neural networks. And then if I searched through my stack for NNets, that's not a string that occurs naturally in English. And then I created a bunch of those little strings, and it's sort of a tiny bit flavored like Zettelkasten. And I'm wondering, Gordon, how did doing Zettelkasten kind of work affect you're coming up with subconscious and how these things maybe fit.
Yeah, Zunke's book was great for me to find because it helped solidify a number of intuitions that I had been forming through my own sort of hacking on note-taking systems. I hadn't been aware of Luhmann at the time. There's this theme throughout your book, Zunke, of thinking as an ambient process. Like if I think you mentioned like this process of sitting down in front of a blank page and having blank page anxiety. I think we've all experienced that it's a sort of indicator of a broken process. That if you have a system like Zettelkasten, when you sit down, a lot of the thinking is already done. And I had this experience actually while practicing Zettelkasten the old-fashioned way. It was sort of a personal experiment. I got a bunch of index cards. I played around with Luhmann's numbering style. There's this very interesting kind of process by which you file a card away. I'm trying to remember the phrase you use, Sonke, but I think it's filing it where you'd like to find it again in the future, something like that. Did I get that right?
Yeah. It's very much like when you look for your keys. It kind of makes sense to put them where you will look for them when you go out of the door.
Yes, it's a very intuitive process. Like you're sort of feeling it out. And I found that it did two things for me that really changed my creative process. One was over time, these little clusters would build up of related thoughts. And they were themes that it felt like I hadn't thought them before, but evidently I had because they were there. The other thing that it did is as I was going through this intuitive process, trying to figure out where to put the card in the shoebox, it was like I would stumble upon ideas that I had completely forgotten about. And then that would spark new ideas. So I'd end up in these creative flurries of like writing new cards and trying to file them. It was like a snowball effect. It was like both very stressful and very generative. And quite unique. I don't feel that way when I use, your average note-taking app. The average note-taking app feels much more like you're sort of taking a note and throwing it into a void. There's no step two, right? That was a really kind of profound shift. And I have to say a lot of the ideas that ended up making their way into the protocol that we're building, into the app that we're building, were very influenced by this notion of trying to close a feedback loop, trying to bump back into things that you've thought about in the past in provocative and creative ways.
Can you say a little bit more about that loop, just about that feedback, how it worked for you, or if you can remember an example?
Yes, I would love to hear Zunke's thoughts on this, but I tend to interpret a lot of things through the lens of this theory, this cybernetics theory, which is sort of the theory of feedback loops. So this is looking at systems and understanding them as sort of recursive conversations. You keep returning to the same state in the system over and over in a loop. And Zettelkasten, for me, did this in a very clever way. You would take a note, and the act of having to file it and then having to think about where to file it was sort of closing a loop between your past self and your present self, because your past self took a bunch of notes on these topics, right? And most of the things that your past self had done, you'd already forgotten about. But the act of having to go back and find the right place to put it was actually like it closed a loop in a really interesting way. One of the insights that I've gleaned from cybernetics is that sort of nonlinear energy in systems always comes from feedback. So my takeaway from this is that if my note-taking practice felt like a slog, it meant that there was a broken feedback loop somewhere. I see Jerry giving the jazz hands. And I noticed too, Sonke, that you use this concept of a feedback loop all over in your book. And I'm wondering if any of that rings true to you and if that was part of your thinking or Luhmann's thinking.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that, and cybernetics is where systems theory comes from. So it draws a lot from the early cybernetics ideas. So the concept of feedback loops and having processes of iteration So change that is not genuinely new in itself, but an iteration from something old, newly assembled. That's all part of Luhmann's toolbox of thinking. So it's certainly no coincidence that it resonates with you on that level. The other thing I find really interesting is what you said earlier about the difference between how people think they think and process and how they actually do that. So this discovery of, well, there's a cluster building up of ideas. I wasn't aware I was thinking about that. And often we don't see thinking as kind of procedural task in itself that has a lot of automatic components to it. It's so easy to think about thinking as everything that's conscious, but that's not true. Even highly abstract scientific theoretical thinking has a lot of intuitive components, and writing them down and putting them into a system helps with making them explicit. And only having them explicit in front of your eyes allows you to tinker with them and realize that your thinking process is actually a little bit different to what you think it is. And for me, it was interesting because I was working on history of science and how people describe how they came to their insights, and what you can gather from the records, how different it is. So it does resonate with my own experience, including discovering that you had thoughts before when you write them down and try to integrate them into a system and see, it's already there. And often my experience is it wasn't even thought by myself, it was someone else, and I kind of absorbed it and turned it into my own idea.
It's really interesting how this landscape of ideas emerges and evolves. And I'm wondering, because Zettelkasten is a slip box and it's very much about boxes, but I'm wondering if either of you ends up wishing that it wasn't a box, that it was something else, like a murder board. You know how they have crime shows where there's photographs with pins and yarn that connects all the ideas, like or a space, a 3D space in which you could sort of wander and stare up at the things. Do you ever find yourself wishing for those things, or are you happy that these things, these nuggets of notes, are sort of contained within a simple thing like boxes of slips?
I find that that's an open question, and I'm curious about people who work on mind map software and visualizing software, and because I often find myself visualizing connections separately and using a whiteboard, and I like the physical space of the whiteboard to look for connections. And I can't do that just looking at the screen at my Zettelkasten itself. So there is an interplay between these tools, and I sometimes wonder if there is a possibility of connecting them in a smarter way than I do it. But that's where technology comes into play. And the other thing I sometimes wonder is about these boundaries between the individual Zettelkasten and what Gordon is working on. Because in systems theory, you need a clear boundary between outside complexity and inside complexity, but it doesn't have to be connected to an individual one subject. It can also be a system which contains out of a group of people or a culture. And so my interest in what Gordon is doing is, how do you create boundaries? Do you think about creating boundaries within a fairly open space of social nodes? What are your thoughts on that?
This is the open question I guess we're exploring, isn't it? I've wanted to understand how to adapt some of the insights from the Zettelkasten method, which, as I read it anyway, was largely developed for a sort of single player context, and to understand how we might adapt those ideas to a multiplayer context, even potentially a massively multiplayer context, like very large crowds. Though I think we'll probably start with the smaller problem of teams. I share your intuition here about systems in nature and in other sort of complex adaptive systems. They have semi-permeable boundaries. One of the ways that has influenced the design of the protocol we're building is we've created these sort of zones of thought, semi-permeable boundary spaces that we call spheres. The protocol is called noosphere, which is a bit of an in-joke. It means planetary thought or planetary consciousness. And it's really those, it's sort of tapestry of little spheres, each which are owned and signed cryptographically by, at this point, an individual, in future maybe teams. But the sphere is semi-permeable in the sense that everything shares the same peer-to-peer substrate. So I could be working on a sphere of thought. Jerry could be working on a sphere of thought. We could actually look at sort of the overlap between these things. We could also, cherry pick ideas back and forth that would retain authorship history. I think this is a greenfield space. I don't think anyone's really nailed it yet. But for me, it felt important to start with the assumption that there ought to be these zones. And this is reflected all the way up at the highest levels of the protocol. There's no namespace that is global. Everything is subjective or intersubjective. There's no quote-unquote objective namespace. And that was sort of a deliberate choice. We felt that it made sense to allow consensus to emerge from the bottom up rather than trying to impose it from the top down. But I will say we have a long road ahead of us, I think, to to figure out what works in sort of bringing these ideas into a multiplayer context. I'm curious, Sonke, if you've seen anyone else, any other researchers exploring this notion of Zettelkasten in a multiplayer space?
Well, it is being discussed, certainly. And there are some experiments. Rome Book Club, for example, tries to put a lot of people into one graph, and they quickly discovered that they need some kind of standardization in notation. I feel I'm not that familiar and not that immersed in it, but I feel it's more moderated. So there are certain people who make then decisions on standardization, while what you described feels more organically developing. That you have the chance of a culture or a thread of a certain topic emerging and then kind of closing up and developing their own standards and ideas, which is then not bound to particular persons, so that people can enter the space, learn the particular culture of it, and develop it further. And you need to find the balance between, okay, a tradition that is still lively enough to allow new content, new ideas, new people to come in, but not being that open that it kind of falls apart.
Let me take a step a little bit backwards, maybe back to single player. How does software change the experience of Zettelkasten? And because you could use different kinds of software to implement it, and software has its things. And I use Readwise, and I'm signed up on Hypothesis, but I don't really use it. But with either of those, I could highlight a piece of text, and in principle, that could become a note in my Zettelkasten. Although I've not tried to use either of those apps to do Zettelkasten. But and then there's a second question lurking right behind that: what happens when 8 people highlight exactly the same page, which you see in several different apps right now? If you're reading on Medium, it'll show you which of your friends highlighted which paragraph in the article you're reading right now, right there, which is kind of cool because it's a step toward multiplayer. But how does software change the experience?
I feel I don't have a good answer here, but I will lead by saying I'm very lazy. And the reason that I'm not a Zettelkasten pro is that the act of filing a physical card for me was both very generative and very taxing. You have to be sort of committed to it almost as a job. It's your work, right? It's your livelihood. It's your creative practice. So part of my, I think, start beginning to pull the thread on what software could do in this space was not only this question of multiplayer, but also in what ways might we cause that kind of bottom-up emergence in an ambient way without so much user intervention. Now, something is lost in that translation process, I freely admit, but I wanted to see if I could create the Zettel experience for the lazy person like me.
I think laziness is really important here. Laziness matters because not that everybody's lazy, but that the effort that you have to expend to create some order out of chaos can't be, huge. You can't have to climb a mountain to go get some benefits for it. It's got to be pretty easy to do and aligned with how your neurons are busy firing every day.
Yeah. Now that said, I did Zettelkasten on hard mode with paper index cards and a pen because I wanted to experience the sort of the most basic level and understand it as a system. But I do know there are a number of software tools these days that make some parts of this process easier. Perhaps Sonke could speak more to them.
I experienced with both physical paper, pen, Zettelkasten, and different tools. I feel it's still a trade-off. There are certain aspects of writing by hand which is distraction-free, which is just a physical way of working I very much like, that gets lost when I look at the screen. There's also the physical arrangement of the notes. You don't need to know exactly where they are. I mean, you kind of know, okay, on the top right, there is the interesting cluster. And that is also lost with software. At least I haven't seen a representation of that physical experience. It came to my mind again reading Annie Murphy-Paul's book on the extended mind, which I find I can highly recommend because it stresses the importance of thinking within physical surroundings. And the Zettelkasten takes it a little bit more metaphorically, thinking inside the Zettelkasten box. But that seems to me the trade-off. On the other hand, you have all the advantages of being able to do a full-text search, of being quicker with moving things around, with having connections suggested, and not having to carry around 70,000 notes.
Accessibility is big, yes.
Yeah.
You're not always near your boxes.
Exactly. It is a lifestyle decision.
Exactly. Exactly.
But I sometimes look for kind of additions to the software experience by, for example, going to the whiteboard, or having a printout very early of a manuscript draft and rearranging papers on my desk. And I feel I need that. But it can be combined. It works in a way.
We had Alice Albrecht on an early podcast, and she has an app called Recollect, where you could think of snippets that she is building a system to help you create documents, to basically write things. And you could think of each of the clips or each of the sections or each of the nuggets as a Zettelkasten element that's being queued up in a sequence that then makes logical sense as a paragraph, as a sentence, as a chapter, right? And going forward. But this whole idea of atomicity, like what is the right chunk size, the right nugget size, and then serendipity, which Gordon was referring to earlier. And I just want to share my screen for a second, because I've been using this brain thing for a really long time, and it has some of these kind of aspects in a really interesting way. Tell me if you can see my brain on the screen.
Yes, I see myself in the brain.
Yeah.
Where's Sonke?
So this is so here's Sonke, and this is and I've got Sonke under Zettelkasten fans. I should also connect you here because so let's go back to you here. Here you are, Gordon. Oh, great. I'm on the new version of the brain, which is freezing every now and then. So I need to stop sharing and crash my brain and come back. Part of what I want to show is that there's like a neighborhood. There's a like one of the interesting things. One of the things that I find compelling about it is that when I'm looking at one thing, I'm looking at everything around it immediately, always, because that's just the way this thing presents information. And that's different from I'm looking at a note or a card or a piece, and then I have to go look up and see other notes next to each other. So, Gordon, when you're talking about the serendipity of when you're looking for a card, you find other cards, I'm picturing myself in the days of yore when I would use libraries and go to the card catalog and I would leaf through or go stand in the shelves and actually, oh, this isn't, here's the book I'm looking for, or where's the book I'm looking for? Oh my gosh, look at these things. And we, I think that was a way that we all increased our serendipity early in life. But we sort of, we don't have enough of that now in our lives. Sorry. So here's my brain back up. And I just wanted to point out a couple things here. These are my notes from this call. So you'll notice below this thought, thinking from the bottom up, is where I'm putting everything related to this podcast episode, including later when we publish it. I will put the video link on top of this thought, etc. And you'll notice down here, these are notes that I took during the conversation. So this is a green field space. Nobody's nailed it yet. And then I've connected it up to Luhmann, who was influenced by Talcott Parsons, who was an early sociologist and systems thinker, who influenced a whole bunch of other people like Alfred Chandler and Robert Neely Bella, and unfortunately all white men back in the day. But there's this whole philosophical kind of tradition that's interesting and kind of at hand. I also connected it to The Professor and the Madman because our conversation got me thinking about when the OED was developed. Basically, there was a guy who was interned in an asylum, William Minor, who contributed sort of the most entries to the dictionary. And I'm wondering what was the format of the slips where everybody contributed to the dictionary, because they had set out a call. Basically, they crowdsourced the OED, and that's interesting. So I'll stop with the screen share, but the notion of adjacency and nugget size is really, really interesting to me in the design of these systems. And it feels to me like there's a bunch of different ways of conquering this. And we're right now in this funny little exploratory phase where there's a bunch of different kinds of software that don't play nicely together. Gordon, one of the things I love about your mission is you're trying to figure out what rules do we need on the playground so that all these different things might play nicely together. And I'm wondering if you'd say a little bit more about that, and we can wander into the multiplayer conversation.
Yeah, although I don't want to oversell it, because what I'm trying to find is the minimum set of enabling rules rather than a sort of maximal set that would force everyone in line. The protocol we're building is very open-ended. It's basically an envelope format that allows you to add some key value metadata, to define a version history, which ends up being quite important for citability, but also for some table stakes things like sync. And it adds a security layer. It's quite inspired actually by SMTP, by HTTP, by the packet switching, very classic protocols. And part of my motivation here is I have a friend who was part of MetaWeb, which was this knowledge graph project in the early 2000s, ended up being acquired by Google, integrated into those knowledge cards that you see. This is one of the largest efforts historically to build a kind of semantic web. And I think often the temptation in trying to get these things to play together is to sort of create a universal language, like a perfect language, a scientific language, right? These efforts often seem not to pan out. These sort of top-down efforts to codify. What the folks at MetaWeb did instead was they kind of ingested a very large amount of mostly coherent information and spent a lot of time getting it to cohere in a sort of second pass. For my money, I think that's the way to approach this problem as well. If we can have a substrate that the apps all share, then you get what in computer science we might call adversarial interoperability. Basically, standards emerge in retrospect. So you have a popular tool like Photoshop that has a proprietary format called PSD. Then all the other competitors are like, hey, I'd like to steal some of those users. So they interoperate with PSD, right? They implement the protocol, and pretty soon you get to this. It's not utopian outcome, but it's a better outcome where everything kind of works together pretty well. And I think that's kind of the pragmatic world that I'm aiming for. I think there are a couple things that I do see in common with a lot of these tools. So I expect we might find some interop at higher levels too. To your point, a sort of unit of thought. I think, Sonke, you call them like shipping containers for thought in the book, which I thought was a beautiful metaphor. This kind of notion that you have a single idea and you box it up. That is something that we're leaning into in the app that we're building. Like, the idea is to have like little small atomic units of thought. I think of them as like little genes, right? Like, and by sort of tumbling them together, you might evolve larger thoughts from the bottom up. And that was actually very influenced by Sonke's book. I think this is something that Zettelkasten does very well, particularly because when you do it with cards, you can't write long. It's not an option. You have to break it down into little chunks.
Yeah, it's one of these restrictions which actually produce a lot of freedom. Looking forward really to what's being developed in this space, and my way of dealing with it as someone who's not actively involved in developing software is I'm trying to keep everything I do in my Zettelkasten as simple as possible, and trying not to explore all the possibilities that individual apps offer, but to restrict myself to something very closely resembling the original pen and paper Zettelkasten. Because my hope is that with developments like yours, there will be a standard somewhere soon that then enables you to be more relaxed about the future developments without locking yourself into some kind of system.
I can't help but wonder how much Luhmann would have loved search, just a computer and its search capacities. Just that might have blown his mind, but that simple feature that we take for granted very often is just so powerful for the kind of work we're thinking about.
Yeah, there were students of him who introduced him to very early Zettelkasten adaptations with very simple hypertext, and he was very clear about not being interested in that.
So interesting, right? And so many original thinkers about this space, whether it's Ted Nelson or others, or Doug Engelbart. Doug Engelbart gave us the mother of all demos, which is the interface that we're using right this minute with each other with overlapping windows, and I've got a mouse-like cursor on the screen. That's all mother of all demos. And then spent the rest of his life trying to replicate that particular exact thing on different machines with more power, instead of riffing on it in different ways with communities of other people doing stuff. And so other people founded the Bootstrap Institute and sort of took his ideas in different directions. But he, in some sense, couldn't or didn't. And I'm just really interested in the kind of mental flexibility that it takes to invent these new paradigms, because as we hinted early in this conversation, it feels like we're on the threshold of somebody coming up with better ways of representing nuggets of concepts and weaving them together into some tapestry for all of us to use together. And my own amateur thesis on this is that we are a stupider civilization than we normally would be because we don't have a shared memory like this. I think this is civilizational urgency around this topic. I don't think this is a, gosh, wouldn't it be cool if we took notes better kind of question. I think this is a, hey, we could probably stop Trump from lying all the time if journalists had a method of sharing what they know and agreeing to something and feeding it into a shared memory that Steve Bannon was also feeding, because he would be in the space as well with his ideas. And I'm just like playing out, what does the space look like that allows, permits, contains players with extremely different goals, opinions, and methods to coexist and play nicely, or at least even if some of them are not trying to play nicely, so that the space doesn't fall apart and dissolve into chaos. Because I think all of us have tried multiplayer tools that rapidly sort of dissolve into the kind of chaos that we're busy trying to avoid here, right? So what is the minimum set of protocols and rules that help us build spaces like that? I think these are really important questions right now.
I feel there is something on a very, very low level missing, where incentives for quality, etc., are being implemented, and not on such a high level where it's becoming clunky and about censorship and all that kind of questions, but just having basic incentives to popularize the quality content, and having that on such low level implemented that a dynamic can emerge. So peer review procedures in science are so enormously clunky when you look at it, and looking for something to scale it down to a tweet level, that is something I'm really looking forward to, that would shift the incentives profoundly.
I see tweets out there and I'm like, each tweet is kind of like a Zettel in a Zettelkasten, right? You could think of the tweet stream as just an endless set of slips floating by in a queue. But then it gets really interesting, because what if any one of us, and when we retweet or when we pin something or do some other software gesture that says, I'd like to either remember this or connect it to other ideas, what is that gesture like and how does that work? Because now it's no longer just a tweet, now it's something else. And that's really interesting, because Gordon, you're trying to think of each of these little nuggets or objects as just floating in some space so that they're reusable, I think, in lots of different ways, in rich ways. And I love that. I think that's an equally important concept, is the sort of composability, modularity, reusability of each of these little shiny nuggets of information.
I share your intuition here about the Twitter. In particular, I think the interest graph is a rather important tool for thought that was sort of created accidentally. And Twitter, I think, doesn't see itself as a tool for thought and actively resists it in many ways. And yet, you do see a little subculture of people using it in this way, almost in a Zettelkasten-like way. Quote tweets are basically transclusions. Threads are essentially like nice little clusters of related thoughts, although there are some limitations. When I look at it, though, I think about if each of these little tweets is sort of like a meme, like a little idea gene. What is the evolutionary selection pressure that's being applied to the system, and what kinds of creatures might we expect to emerge out of the primordial ooze? It doesn't seem to me to be really applying a selection pressure that we would expect to generate sort of coherent thought. It's often he who dunks the most sort of gets the most Twitter points. Rather adversarial kind of in tone, very emotive, like it's all about the likes, it's all about the retweets and boosting. So retweets as a kind of viral mechanism, I think, reward very aggressive content because you can get reach by saying something everyone likes. You can also get reach by saying something everyone dislikes, but you can really get reach if you say something that's like poised on the knife's edge, so that a large number of people like it and another large number of people dislike it, and they'll fight over it endlessly. And that's really what gets you the big, sort of viral hits. So I wonder in what ways we might be able to borrow some of these mechanisms, but perhaps set up a different kind of environment that rewards other kinds of behavior. I don't want to make too much of a normative statement here, but it does seem like if we want to evolve complex ideas, we might be able to borrow some techniques from systems that have worked to evolve complex ideas, like Zettelkasten or like peer review. In what ways might that be adapted to a sort of multiplayer context? Can it be made easy? I think there has been actually some successful experimentation here. Recently, Twitter rolled out this sort of fact-checking tool where you can essentially crowdsource context for a viral tweet. This seems to work much better than I would expect. I feel that the space of mechanisms like this has barely been explored yet. But it does feel crucial that we figure out how to think together over the network. We sort of have whole planet challenges ahead of us, like climate change, right? Like biodiversity loss. Like, how are we going to tackle those if we can't think at a similar scale?
Absolutely. Sonke?
I totally agree. I think that is the big task we have in front of us, because everything else is kind of dependent on that. If we want to find new big solutions for global problems, we need spaces to explore solutions, and you need the right incentives to do that. So thinking about these questions seems absolutely crucial to me as well. And on top of incentives of quality and fact-checking, etc., it's also about not losing sight of things that already work, because it's still incentivized for news, for new ideas. And what you mentioned earlier about the Zettelkasten is having old ideas resurface and having new ideas checked back with things already working. Even in science, you don't have the incentives of repeating old ideas, even though they are much more likely better than a new idea, because they've already proven to work. And it gives you also a better idea about the state of the world, when you not only focus on things that are currently discussed, but also taking into account solutions that already work, so we don't pay attention to them anymore.
We seem to have this fascination with the new and this deprecation of the old. And so it seems like a lot of people are busy reinventing stuff that's already been there before, because we are all building on the shoulders of giants, et cetera, et cetera. One of the interesting things is to understand sort of the lineage of an idea and the many different kind of attributions that are worth thinking about as you use the idea and go implement it. Not that everybody needs like to be credited in the footnotes, each time, but rather that these are assemblages of insights from different places. When I was young, I watched the Connection series on PBS that James Burke did, and that had the motivational sort of force for me that Carl Sagan or Star Trek or other things had for other people. And I've met tons of people who like, oh my God, once I read X or watched the movie, watched Star Wars for the first time, I knew what I was going to do for the rest of my life. But for me, it was this thread of connections, of adjacencies and conjunctions and accidents and insights that took, hey, I'm going to borrow from this and connect it to that. And the medium doesn't let us do that. We're sort of in this, as you were saying, Gordon, earlier, we've trapped information in little app boxes, right? Where once they're in apps, they're in that app and not in another app. And that's holding us back in some really interesting way. So I'm wondering, what do you both see in the road going forward, just generally? Like, what do you wish for, or what do you see emerging? Anything like that? What does the road ahead look for what does the optimistic road ahead look for you?
I'll offer a couple thoughts, and then I'd love to turn it over to Sonke. When I started this journey, it felt like of building an open protocol for thought. It felt like a real uphill battle. But I think there's a funny inflection point happening now. This is just maybe a high-level observation. On the technical level, there have been a number of developments around what Jay Graber over at Twitter Blue Sky calls self-certifying protocols. This is a little in the weeds, but it used to be the case that to securely do something with a computer, you had to essentially have some root of authority. Now, ordinarily, that's fine. I think what it means, though, in practice is that users don't really own their data or their experience if they're interacting with the network. Somebody else does, somebody who's running that cloud computer. But there's a new sort of range of cryptographic protocols, one of which we're using IPFS. It's a peer-to-peer protocol that allow you to make sort of certain security attestations without any root authority. They use math, basically. They use cryptography to kind of make security guarantees. Now, this is really low-level stuff. But what it does do is it kind of lets us construct protocols like Newsphere, the protocol we're building, that are kind of outside the reach of any particular app or player. Like, we're building Newsphere, we're building an app on top. But if you want to build something on top of Newsphere, I can't tell you no. It's out there. It's an open protocol. Likewise, if you're a user and you're putting your data into the app, it's getting persisted onto Newsphere, you can get it out again. You can get it out again through any IPFS node, which, there's a bunch of them out there. Cloudflare runs a bunch. People who, I don't control. And so your stuff kind of belongs to you in a way that it didn't in the past. It's also possible to link across apps through this shared space in a way that wasn't possible in the past. I feel this is kind of hopeful, and it's sort of happening at this funny moment where a lot of these large web platforms, there's a lot of drama on Twitter today with the Elon Musk takeover. Many people are unhappy, and they find themselves in the unfortunate position of suddenly realizing there's no exit, right? Like, you can't take it with you. It belongs to Elon. This is, that's fine. It's a business, but it doesn't really seem like a good way to be constructing a shared repository of knowledge for humanity. Like, I would much more ideally like that to belong to everybody. So,
Absolutely.
just
Amen.
speaking as a technologist, this is tractable in a way that it wasn't even 6 or 7 years ago. So there's a long road ahead and a lot to do, but I feel quite hopeful, and I'm pretty excited about the people we see showing up, on our open source project, contributing. Feels like perhaps there are some marginally brighter days ahead.
I hope so. And Sonke, before you head into the future, IPFS is the interplanetary file system. Are you wandering into those areas? Is that familiar territory for you, or is that part of where the tech world is heading off your radar right now?
Well, I kind of follow developments, but very broadly, and as a layperson who doesn't really understand what's going on. But what I'm interested in, Gordon, where do you see the role of institutions? So, because what you described is very much private enterprise, and I share your optimism, how much still is possible and how much of a breakthrough it would be to have a more interconnected shared information space that is not locked in individual labs and controlled by individual companies. But what is about institutions like science, like governmental institutions or existing non-governmental institutions who also develop ideas about approaching information in a more shared thing? I'm thinking about Bellingcat or forensic architecture, so open source organizations. So is there a way of collaboration, looking out for solutions they already came up with, offering technology? So what are your thoughts on that?
That's an excellent question. I think a lost social technology in tech is this process of institution building. If you look at the bones of most of the systems we use today, the sort of the Web 1.0, if you will, it still today runs on top of shared institutions, the IETF, ICANN, W3C. I think there was a brief period between sort of that era of tech and maybe the Web 2.0 era of tech. We could call it Web 1.5, where we still had that social technology. We had the Wikimedia Foundation, the Apache Foundation, All of these systems, these institutionalized kind of systems, seem to have a lot more longevity than much of the rest of tech. Like, who remembers MySpace? But you know what? Like, W3C is still trucking, and so is the IETF, and they're just quietly humming away, writing these shared standards that keep everything else running. I think it'll be a good challenge for us to do some institution building in the future. We're already beginning a little bit of this process. There are other people in the IPFS world who are, sort of contributing shared infrastructure peers to the network. We're not the only ones. There are a lot of people who do it for a lot of reasons. We've been talking about sort of building an institution, maybe call it something like the Content Addressing Alliance. So you could think of it as something like ICANN, an open body that anyone can join. There's a long road ahead, and we're at a very, very early stage here. But for my perspective on the matter is that this is the way you build things that last. And I think there's a story here in which these institutions coexist rather nicely with, sort of shorter-lived commercial things too. Like, if you're thinking on the decades timescale, using sort of this Stuart Brandian framework of pace layers, you could think of the apps as being perhaps on a high-level fast pace layer, and these institutions building infrastructure on a much lower sort of bedrock level pace layer, and we need both.
Let me insert a little chain of thinking here, because I think it might be useful and it's fascinating to me. There's a book I read a while ago called The Institutional Revolution: Measurement and Economic Emergence of the Modern World, written by Doug Allen, I think at UCLA. And it was really cool. It focused on the pre-modern British aristocracy. And it said, why did these people hunt foxes with hounds and have expensive estates out in the middle of nowhere? Why did they have inherited positions when primogeniture? Why did they offer their daughters to court? There's a whole bunch of really weird behaviors in the aristocracy. And he says this was all a way of creating trust at a distance. And he coins the term hostage capital. And he says the crown basically had aristocrats hostages because they were all in on being aristocrats, and short of being executed or imprisoned, they could be cut away. If they were cut away for having done something unfaithful to the crown, they did not get good educations. The young men, women weren't educated at all, but the young men were busy like learning Greek and Latin and doing the grand tour of Europe. They were not given practical educations in what now we would think of as management, because then you might be actually useful. Right? It's very, very interesting. And so I say all of that because there's a series of things we can look back on and think of as very dysfunctional that led to Rule Britannia for like 150 years. And the British Empire. And so now I find myself fascinated in institutional design, and I'll add a second thread in, which is most of our institutions today are designed from mistrust of the average person. So we build coercive systems. So the compulsory education system is one of my sort of happy targets here, or maybe unhappy targets, because it's so coercive and it creates scarcity at every turn. And the internet and the institutions you just put in the conversation, Gordon, are designed from trust, is what I call it. The internet, like, the cool thing is that the IETF isn't busy inventing protocols. They're busy accepting proposals for protocols that got crowdsourced. And like the threshold is, hey, do you have a working protocol? Do you have running code? And do you have a bunch of people who'll say, yes, this works, and it works like as advertised, and here's what we're doing with it? In which case, cool, what we're going to do is we're going to bless it as one of the protocols that we think is safe and useful and part of the suite that composes the internet and the internet's future. And that's really cool because it's different from saying, hey, we're going to have an institution that's going to tell us what to do in the future. It's this emergent bottom-up kind of thinking that leads to new platforms, new ways of being, and all of that. And the web, Wikipedia, the internet are all what I think of as designed from trust. And sorry to insert a whole bunch of things there, but I think these things play into the future we would like in interesting ways, because there is so much here that's about this boring sounding topic of institutional design, and yet it's cool. It's completely hot. Like, gets me all excited anyway.
Yeah, it's remarkable what a small community of practice can do given long enough timescales. I think a lot of people in this sort of very utopian movement that some people call Web3 are rediscovering a lot of these things the hard way. Like, this institutional design, social practice has just been lost, and we're recovering it in many ways. But yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. I think we've got our work cut out for us. But in general, the things that last are things with communities of practice and institutions around them.
Sonke, anything you'd like to add, or other things about the future of this space that matter to you?
Yeah, I was thinking about what you said about trust, and I'm wondering what is, do we think enough about what we need in institution to be able to build them on trust? So to have self-correcting mechanisms, to come back to Gordon's reference to cybernetics, it doesn't work with fixed designs, but you need dynamic systems that are self-correcting to build them on trust. And I'm kind of optimistic that they will outlast other experiments that won't work out that well.
We're sort of pressure testing all these things right now, because communities that are high trust, that use trust, and learn what it means to do that is not a natural, instinctive thing. This is hard-won knowledge. So Lynn Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2006 or 2008 for her work on governance principles for governing commons. And around the world, if you go pop the hood on indigenous ways of knowing, there's a whole bunch of peoples around the world who understood how to manage commons together and make them fruitful so that everybody could live off the commons. And then we went and squished all of this and are living under a set of regimes that are given assumptions for how life must be. One of the SDGs from the United Nations is poverty. We can't have people being poor. And I'm like, I would love it if people didn't need money so much and they still had shelter and food and were happy. Like, could we go back to that? Because that's what life was like before the Industrial Revolution. It's like the idea that one family would fall off because they didn't have money wasn't a thing. Now, if they violated the norms of the village, they might be ostracized and pushed to go to some other village. That was a really bad punishment back in the day. But right now, we're busy pressure testing all these institutions and ideas, because when a bad actor shows up in a community that has these good practices, they're often overwhelming. They often have weapons that the communities can't resist. And one of the questions is, in the world of software and ideas, what are the defensive techniques that don't mute participation and generosity and contribution, but instead promote the generative use of these new ideas that are resilient to or resistant to intentional assaults, or what I call sometimes denial of discourse attacks, right? How do I flood the zone with shit so much that you can't even have a fruitful conversation anymore? It's a legitimate strategy. So I think we're in that world, in the realm of ideas right now. And I'm really interested in the connection between boxes of slip notes and those conversations, because I think that's really, really important. And how we clip out ideas and put them in our slips and share them with each other is a piece of how we solve this problem together.
Yeah, and a lot is already in the title of thinking from the bottom up. I think that's kind of the common topic. In designing institutions, protocols, etc., you can't do that top down. So it might be a self-reinforcing feedback loop that you have places to think in about how to improve the systems we think in, bottom up instead of top down.
I love that. We're getting near the end of our sort of time. Gordon, do you want to add something to that? It feels like you've been thinking in that area for a whole while.
I'll just offer, going back to Eleanor Ostrom, a key condition for being able to make sense together and to sort of avoid that sociopathic free rider problem you're talking about is for communities to have semi-permeable boundaries and self-determination. That basically means the community needs to own the commons, not someone, in far away in Cupertino or elsewhere. It has to be something that belongs to the people participating in it. So I'm rather excited for a future where that's actually becoming more and more possible.
And ironically, and I need either of you to think of something brighter to say than what I'm about to say. But ironically, between Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, for example, two of the wealthiest people on the planet own two of the most popular properties where all these ideas are being disseminated, shared, superconducted, sort of hyper accelerated, and so forth. Still, even as Facebook maybe is losing some users, the average monthly users total more than the populations of India and China combined. So Facebook is the largest country on the planet, and it has a benevolent dictator named Mark Zuckerberg. And I'm unclear on the word benevolent necessarily. But that's the world that we're sort of facing, right? And all these decentralized protocols are a little crankier and quirkier to use, and yet they offer the future that we're painting here, and they care really a lot about the commons. And I don't know how much of a commons everything everybody's pouring into Facebook actually is.
Yeah, having an emperor might be great up until you get a bad emperor, and then it's not so great.
And then it's not so great. Ask the Romans.
Problem.
Yeah, ask the Romans.
In politics, that's called the bad emperor problem. I think, there are returns to scale and centralization, but over long enough time scales, I think, nature shows decentralized systems are more resilient. So I think we're seeing some of the sort of Web 2 centralized approach to things maybe falter a little bit right now. I won't prematurely call time on it, but I think that it's pretty clear that one era has sort of saturated and that something new is on the horizon. Unclear exactly what it is just yet, but it'll be different.
We're busy looking. Sonke, any closing thoughts for this call?
No, I really like what Gordon said earlier about the commons and this optimistic view about the development of a new phase in technology. So I am really curious following what's coming up, and I feel we are at a cusp of something new. So I'm happy to be able to get a glimpse into what you guys are thinking in this area.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being our guest here, both of you. I'm excited about this whole Tools for Thinking space because I keep running into what I think of as bonfires on the horizon. There's a group of people who are the cult of Rome, right? And busy exploring Rome and sharing stuff with each other and making it better. And then there's a bunch of people who are doing Zettelkasten and really into it. There's Tiago Forte has built a second brain in his communities. And these are sort of bonfires, and they haven't walked across like at Burning Man to the man to sit and meet and share their art and talk over a good cocktail. But we're heading right there. I think that's the place that we're going. And I'm very hopeful that those conversations and interactions lead us into the world we've been kind of painting on this call. Thank you all for listening to Tools for Thinking, a new podcast that might just help you with your thinking. If you're part of a startup in this sector, please knock on our door at betaworks.com.